I feel like I'm in a rock concert, and I should have been the warm-up band for Chantal. She spoke about Alzheimer's. I don't know if you heard about this this man and wife. The woman thought maybe that I don't know. He had this. He was forgetting things. Forgot their anniversary, for example, several years in a row. So they went to the hospital and had a test. And it's quite a complicated test. I don't know if you've gone into that. And it takes about a week to get the results. And about a week later, the hospital called her and said, Mrs. Brown, there's a problem. And she said, oh, my God. There are two Mr. Browns that came the same day. One we tested for Alzheimer's and the other for AIDS. And look, we've mixed up the results. We don't know who's who. The tests are very expensive. OHIP won't pay for doing them again. She said, what am I going to do? I said, well, we thought long about this, and drive your husband into the center of town, drop him off, and tell him to walk home. If he gets home, don't sleep with him. So it's what are we talking about? It's great to be here. I guess I have a pretty free agenda. Chantal's covered Canada, I guess. I'll cover the world, and that way in 20 minutes, we can know everything, right? Well, a few quick points. Not surprisingly, there's a lot going on, right? So on one hand, we're in a G2 world. Imagine in that G2 world, we had two leaders like Donald Trump, not just one. But China also had a Donald Trump. That would be really scary, right? One country, China, is changing very quickly, purposely, with leadership. It's no longer the China of 10 years ago, of 20 years ago. It's a China that's moving very quickly to deploy also its enormous wealth and resources and economic capacity across Asia, into Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, South Asia, into the Middle East and Africa. It's changing so quickly the global balance of power. When I graduated from Glendon, it was the time of the Cultural Revolution, right? I think in 1979, when I guess we could call it the third Chinese Revolution, the first one being the Nationalist Revolution in 1915, and then 1949, the Communist Revolution, and then the Market Revolution, I guess we could call it, from 1979. At that time, you know, their economy was this size relative to ours. Even in 1995, the Canadian economy was much bigger than the Chinese economy. And today, well, you know, it's 6, 7 times larger, and the momentum continues to build. So that's one whole area that we can think of. Trump will be going back to China, in November. At least that's the plan at the moment. The first meeting they held in Florida was sort of to, who are you, what do you want to do for your country? That was, let's get to judge each other, to know each other a little bit. The second meeting will be a working session. I doubt that there's the capacity on the American side to put in place the type of architecture that would settle that relationship for the next 20 or 30 years as Kissinger, Nixon, Deng, and Zhou Enlai did in the early 1970s. So this will continue to be conflictual relationship, but the G2 is what's driving the world, and that's already directly over 40% of world GDP. And the interesting thing is that we aren't really much part of that. And so that's why it was important, I think, that Trudeau re-engaged, joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, committed to start discussions on free trade with China. We have to do it in education. We have to do it in so many areas. So that's one basket of things I guess we could look at. We could look at the Middle East. There's a lot going on. The 25th of this month, there's the referendum for independence of Kurdistan. Israel has come out strongly to support the independence of Kurdistan, and wouldn't surprise you. Hamas and Al-Fatah, they've come together for the first time, and they've overcome their differences after negotiations in Cairo. 10 days ago, Turkey and Iran met at the military level for the first time since 1979, since the Ayatollahs came to power, because they're all concerned that what will happen if Kurdistan actually does become independent. The Assad government is retaking control of most of Syria with the help of its allies and stabilizing, but that's still going to be very messy. Then we have Saudi Arabia, which is likely to have a new king over the next 12 months, the young crown prince at 32 years of age, who's got the country locked in a endless war in Yemen. So the Middle East is going to continue to be agitated as I look at it. When I turn on American TV, which I try not to do very often, I just hear this profusion of hysteria about Russia. It's interesting, our country shares about 80% of the sovereignty of the Arctic with Russia. Last summer, our commodity company exported iron ore from Norway through the Northwest Passage to China. The Americans want to see that all as an international waterway. I think instead of getting caught up in the hysteria about Russia, that's the political hysteria that's characteristic of America at the moment, we should be talking with Russia quite intensely about the Arctic and the big issues that are there: sovereignty, security, environment. What happens if there's a big environment issue and it straddles our area of security and the Russian area of security? Are we going to work on that? So many issues there for us to discuss: commerce, the free movement of shipping. When I look at, I'm sort of a naive guy, so when I look at things, I look at the geography. Remember, we had a great professor here, George Tatham. And from George's course, I remember that life would be very different when you're in Moscow looking at the world if there was a mountain range somewhere between the French-German border and Moscow. Well, that's flat land, and Russia's been invaded 7 times from the west. The last time was by the Nazis, and 28 million Russians died. That's 1 per family. So you can understand the preoccupation of any leader of Russia with the stability on Russia's immediate geographic borders. And Russia doesn't have access to a permanently warm water port. Well, yes, there's Sevastopol, but from there you have to go through the Bosphorus, the Dardanelles, and the Straits of Gibraltar. So it's easy to pinch each one of those before you get to a real ocean. My view is that if any one of us in this room was president of Russia, and there was 1/10 of 1% chance that Crimea and Sevastopol would fall into NATO hands, if you didn't take it over, you'd be out of power within 24 hours. And given the history of invasion, obviously, if you were leading Russia, you would become extremely nervous. The prospects of Ukraine becoming a NATO country. Our Prime Minister, or the Prime Minister of our country, when I was a student, Pierre Trudeau, afterwards, after being Prime Minister, he became, with Helmut Schmidt, president of something called the Interaction Council, which gathered former G7 leaders. And once in a while, Prime Minister Trudeau invited me to meet with the group. I remember once at a meeting in Basel, Switzerland, late in the afternoon after a session of discussion, I was walking through the foyer of the hotel, and I saw Schmidt and Trudeau over in the corner by the fireplace having a drink. I sort of walked through by, and Prime Minister Trudeau said, come and join us. I said, I don't want to interrupt you two, look like you're in very deep conversation. What are you talking about? And Trudeau said, Helmut and I have just agreed that the eastward expansion of NATO, if it happens, will poison our relations with Russia for generations. And of course, that's what's happening. So we, I think, can engage with Russia on a legitimate and real basis, and it would be about the Arctic. Let me, Chantal, say or say a couple words about the global economy in conclusion, and we can discuss things. I think it looks okay at the moment. After the U.S. crash, of course, we entered a period of delevering, which is where the debt has continued to increase. So it's a very strange delevering, right? I think global gross debt today is about 45% higher than it was when the U.S. imploded. And everyone talks, when you hear debt, you talk about government debt, but government debt is actually not the problem. Except in Japan and most countries, it's less than 25% of GDP. The real problem with gross debt is, and it varies in different countries. In this country, it's the household sector. It's the corporate sector. It's the finance sector in different countries. So in that context, if interest rates go up too far too fast, we've got a lot of debt to juggle up there that isn't viable at substantially higher real interest rates. It's like riding a motorcycle. You don't know we're going around the corner too fast until you crash. So this is a concern that the central bankers talk themselves into raising interest rates higher and faster than they should. But that's out sometime, I think, still. But for the moment, China's doing well, 6.5%, 7% growth. India's come off a little bit, but it'll do 5 or 6 this year. Europe is bouncing. That's hardly the term, but it's going to be 1.5, 2. Spain 3, Greece 3% growth this year. The U.S. 2, 2.25. Our country's doing the best in the G7. So for the first time, and Fred Gorbett, if he's in the room somewhere, he'll correct me, but I think for the first time since 1980, we have a coordinated, or a synchronized, not coordinated, uplift in the world economy. Oil's still cheap. Inflation's not very strong. In fact, it's negligent in most places. There's still slack in the system. You have very relatively low participation rates in the U.S., so that indicates there's still further slack despite where the official unemployment rate is. Our country has still lots of, I think, slack, although the central bank seems to have a somewhat different view. Productivity isn't great, but it looks like in some countries it's rebounding. Investment, there's a lot of investment that can still come. So on the whole, I'm fairly positive for the world economy as we meet this morning. So the real issues that could destabilize the world, I guess, are more the political issues. And one that we're hearing every day about, of course, is North Korea. My first visit to North Korea, I don't know if anyone's been to Pyongyang, but it reminds me of Ottawa. Two cars are a traffic jam. Very quiet, many parks. People don't look overfed. Well organized. You skate on the river in the wintertime. But I remember I was with a group from the Asia Society, and I asked the #2 in the military commission, why don't you do like the Chinese have done? Naive me. I was thinking, why don't you make the economic reforms the Chinese have made? He said, we're doing exactly what the Chinese have done. I said, well, how's that? He said, well, you know, the Chinese were terrified for many years after 1949 that the US or the West would do something to overturn the regime. And so Mao invested a great deal in developing a deterrent. In other words, the atomic bomb and ballistic missiles. And there was, if you go back to read the newspapers of the late 50s and 1960s, you'll hear about this reckless, dangerous leader of China who was faking the development of nuclear weapons. He was an idiot and a danger to the world. And then in 1964, when China demonstrated convincingly that it could send rockets 6,000 and 7,000 miles and that it had a hydrogen bomb, all of a sudden we started to deal with them on a different plane. So he said, that's what we're doing. We're building a deterrent. And once we get it in place, we hope then we can negotiate a peace treaty with the Americans, and then we'll go to reform. It's just that we're poor and small, and it takes us a lot longer than it took the Chinese. Whether that's true or not, Trump's speech the other day in New York was quite bizarre. Because on one hand, he threatened North Korea as, you know, in his own rhetoric, it's pretty hot. If you don't come to an agreement with us to get rid of your nuclear bomb, he said, we're going to bomb you back into the Stone Age. A message, part of the country is already in the Stone Age. But then he said, that agreement we made with the Iranians, I don't like it, and I'm not going to respect it, is basically what he said. So if you're in Pyongyang, you want to negotiate with a guy like that who a few weeks later, months later, say, I don't like this treaty, I'm not going to respect it anymore? So Trump, I don't get it. But my sense is that over time there will be some negotiation. I don't think there will be a hot war. And some country, probably China and Russia, will have to guarantee the security of North Korea. And then the US and North Korea would sign a peace treaty for the war from the 1950s, the Korean War. And then in that agreement, there would be some phase down to a certain level of their nuclear capacity. So, well, there's a lot of hot headlines about North Korea. I personally think that there will continue to be hot headlines and not hot war. Maybe I should leave it there and we can go on to whatever. Thanks.